Matthew chapters 23 to 25 together are known as the Olivet Discourse. It's recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels, but in greatest detail in Matthew. These chapters and the corresponding passages in Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21 are key chapters in the Bible as it pertains to eschatology. Eschatology simply being the study of end things. The Olivet Discourse is actually the longest recorded prophetic word of Jesus. What we know is that Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience with a heavy emphasis on Jesus' fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. What we see in Matthew chapter 24 is that Jesus and his disciples are sitting on the Mount of Olives when the disciples ask Jesus some questions. After this, Jesus answers by talking about false leaders claiming to be Christ, wars, earthquakes, famines, persecutions, and people falling away from the faith. He also talks about the gospel being preached around the world, followed by destruction, tribulation, and people being taken away. Typically, these questions in verse 3 are grouped together, and we're told that the disciples are asking about the second coming of Jesus, and that these things refer to the events that will precede the second coming and to the end of the world as we know it. However, many reputable Bible scholars believe that these things actually happened by AD 70. And the more I've looked at it, the more I believe this to be true also. If you remember, at this stage, when the disciples ask these questions, they aren't even convinced that Jesus is going to die, let alone that he's going to return again. What you can see in these passages is that the disciples actually ask 3 questions. When we understand this, we're able to understand the answers that Jesus gives. I'm going to read to you from Matthew 24, verse 3. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? When will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So the 3 questions are, when will these things happen? Number 2, what will be the sign of your coming? And number 3, what about the end of the age? Now, what are the things that the disciples are talking about? For context, we need to look at the preceding verses in Matthew 23. Here we find Jesus in Jerusalem near the end of his ministry. His authority has been questioned, and the high priests were looking for a way to trap him and to kill him. On this particular day, Jesus was speaking in the temple at Jerusalem. He tells the crowds and his disciples to watch out for the scribes and the Pharisees. Then in verse 13, he specifically starts talking to these religious leaders. Jesus rebukes the religious leaders a total of 7 times, saying, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you blind guides, you hypocrites." Jesus builds to a climax in which he declares a severe judgment against those religious leaders. You can read the judgment that he pronounces against them in verses 33 to 35 of chapter 23. Let's have a look together. Verse 33, "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore I am sending you prophets and wise men and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar." And he says to them in verse 36, "Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." Jesus gives a timetable for these prophetic judgments. When Jesus says from Abel to Zechariah, that's significant because in the Hebrew Bible, Abel was the first book and Zechariah is the last book. In other words, the blood of every righteous person from the beginning of their holy book to the end would come upon the religious leaders and on their generation, not a future generation. Now, as most of you know, a generation typically is 40 years. So Jesus is saying here that these judgments will fall upon those standing before him and to those in the next 40 years. He then goes on to explain what this great judgment would look like. We're still in chapter 23, but verses 37 to 38 now. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. When Jesus talks about your house being left to you desolate, he's referring to the temple. Then what we see in chapter 24, verses 1 to 2, is we see Jesus is leaving the temple. Interestingly, this is the last recorded time Jesus ever went to the temple. So he's leaving the temple when his disciples come up to him, calling his attention to the temple buildings. And Jesus turns to them and he says, "Do you not see all these things?" In other words, do you see these temple buildings? Truly I says to you, says Jesus, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. Jesus is saying to the scribes and Pharisees that destruction would come upon them, their city and their temple. Their house would be left desolate, the temple would be torn down. It's this judgment that the disciples were asking about when they said, when would these things happen? Now Jesus made his declaration in Matthew 23 and his prophecy in Matthew 24 around AD 30 to 32. So what do we see happening in the 40 years following this time? If you know your history, you will know that in AD 70 that Jerusalem was destroyed. Following this, the Roman commander ordered the temple in Jerusalem to be demolished so completely that each and every stone was carried away, and the land that the temple stood on was ploughed over. The temple was totally destroyed as Jesus said it would be. Some people think today's Western Wall, also called the Wailing Wall, was part of the temple that existed in Jesus' day. But this is not so. It was part of the parapet that King Herod had built around the temple. John Wesley says of these verses in that time, "This was most punctually fulfilled, for after the temple burned, Titus the Roman general ordered the very foundations of it to be dug up, after which the ground on which it stood was ploughed. This generation of men now living shall not pass till all these things are done." The expression implies that a great part of that generation would pass away, but not the whole. Just so it was, for the city and temple were destroyed 39 or 40 years after. Could the Great Tribulation refer to the siege of Jerusalem in AD 66 to 70, within the time of the generation immediately following Jesus' declaration? The belief of many reputable scholars is yes. The fact that Jerusalem and the temple was so completely destroyed is incredibly significant. It truly was a great tribulation to the Jewish nation. Make sure you watch my message AD 70, the Great Tribulation, to find out why.